Welcome to this week's episode of Faster Masters Rowing Radio. Grab a seat at the table as Masters rowing coaches Marlene Royal and Rebecca Caro share their biggest secrets on how to unleash your hidden potential and plot a new course for real results on the water and off. Now, on to the show.
Well, hello everybody, and welcome to this week's edition of Masters Rowing Radio. I'm Rebecca Caro, and today we're going to be talking about rowing stories and why storytelling is such an important part of our sport. Picture the scene. You're on a riverbank somewhere, and standing next to you is someone else who you know is in the sport, and you're watching a crew go by. Chances are one of you will say to the other, "That reminds me," and a story will follow. So what is it about our sport that makes us such good storytellers, and why are stories so important to the big history of rowing? Today, I'm delighted to welcome as my guest, Steve O'Connor. Steve, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Morning. Thank you for having me.
Now, you were a rowing coach and you've had a very interesting background in the sport of rowing in the UK. Just give us a quick pen portrait of what's taken you from where you were to where you are now.
Yes, well, I mean, I've always been a club rower, so loved my club rowing from school through university and then into various clubs around the UK when I was moving with work. And reached a point where I was doing my 9 to 5 in the corporate world, but spending all of my other waking hours involved in rowing, whether it be training or administration. And to be honest, most of the hours at work as well, I was doing something. So reached a bit of a turning point where I had an opportunity to become a full-time coach for one of the clubs down in Putney. As in my early 20s at that point. So made the decision to have a go at that and see where it led. And had 5 very happy years at a place called Barnell's Boathouse, which was all about grassroots rowing, helping local schools get on the water, which then led on to starting Fulham Reach Boat Club, which was a similar charity, but with a slightly different twist on it in that we then built the whole boat club around inclusion and working with groups that don't normally get the chance to go on the water. So I had 10 very happy years there, and latterly now I've taken over as director at the River and Rowing Museum in Henley on Thames. So another rowing charity, but with a slightly different remit this time.
So let's talk about rowing stories. Am I right that rowers tell more stories in your view than other sports?
100%. It's really interesting talking to rowers about why most of their friends are rowers, and I see this far more in rowing than in other sports. So your average 5-a-side football player doesn't get together year after year with people he played football with when he was at school or university or in a club side. But in rowing, those bonds and those stories seem to run very deep and seem to last the ages. So I think as a sport, we do tell fantastic stories. I think we've got good storytellers in the sport. And I think the nature of the sport allows us to lean into that with the fact that it is the ultimate team sport. It is strength endurance. So it's really, really blimmin' hard to take part in rowing and be good at it and race. And that in itself creates opportunities for great storytelling. And I think it's important. It's important for us to do that because it becomes a great advert for the sport ongoing.
Now, the River and Rowing Museum is an architecturally award-winning building on the banks of the River Thames at Henley upon Thames in southern England. What is the broad remit for someone who's never heard of it? What's the museum about?
Well, in essence, we are a museum that focuses on 3 things. So we focus on the town of Henley on Thames and tell all the stories outside of rowing. We focus on the sport itself and try and talk about the people and places that are relevant to the sport across the world. And then we try and talk about the river, specifically the River Thames. And so at the moment, we're starting to shift our narrative on the river around climate change, the ecology, and the environmental impacts that we're having on the river and how we can protect it moving forward. So those are the 3 areas we focus on. We then also have a secondary focus on local artists as well as then all the spin-off areas that all museums have. So our events, our outreach, and as well as all of that, we have a huge education program where we'll teach about 5,000 kids a year about the river and the sport at the moment.
Now, as a man who knows rowing well, what does it take to run a rowing museum?
Blimey. Well, funny enough, it's a bit like being in a rowing boat. It's a bit like being part of a good crew. It's well, first, it's a real joy to run it. I really do enjoy leading it, and it's a joy because we've got an incredible bunch of people that work there and that are surrounded in the peripheries around making it work. But to run a museum, I guess there's a few different layers. So first of all, I've got to set the strategy and the direction, like any good cox. You've got to, set the course for the crew, and we've got to make sure that actually we're doing that in context of the times. We're telling relevant stories, and we're making predictions on where we think both the narrative and our visitors are going to want to go. So, on one level, we're setting the strategy. On the second level, then, my main day-to-day job is to run the team. So we have 26 staff that work at the museum. And so I'm making sure that they have everything they need to be able to do their jobs. And then at the sort of real operational level, and this is the bit I'm learning about, is the day-to-day mechanics of actually operating a collection of 35,000 objects, and making sure that as trustees and guardians of that collection, we are looking after it in a way that an accredited museum such as ours has to. So it's been fascinating to learn about that. I've spent a lifetime picking up and moving boats, and you can't just do that anymore. Now there's a 7-step process that we have to go through to actually pick something up and move it, which has been interesting to get to grips with. And I've had my knuckles wrapped a couple of times for moving things I shouldn't have. But it's great. It's a real joy, as I say, and it's a fascinating place to work.
So my recollection of the museum, you come in at the ground floor, they go past this fabulous statue of Redgrave and Pinsent holding their oars outside. And then in the entrance foyer, you are sort of welcomed. There's a cafe, gift shop, educational stuff, but upstairs is where the magic happens. Would you like to describe for our listeners what it's like to walk through that first very long gallery?
Yeah, so as you go up our stairs, you turn left, you go into our rowing gallery. We're pretty sure only dedicated rowing gallery in the world. And as you mentioned at the start, it's designed by the architects of David Chipperfield. It was his first main building he built in the UK. And he's since gone on to do, several museums and win lots of awards. But it's designed in the style of an Oxfordshire boathouse. So we have a large pitched roof. And as you look down the gallery, it's all opened up. And we have several boats from the ages actually hung up in the roof. And then as you look down through the gallery, we have different sections of the sport where we try and talk about those peoples and places. So, the big ones we talk about are the boat race, the Henley Regatta and the Olympics. But then we also go in to talk about the Doggets, the Sculling World Championships. We talk about how lifeboats used to be crewed, how the Greeks had a trireme they would use to go and attack other nations, even down to whaling and how rowing boats were used to help with whaling back in the day. So several different areas on display there. And it does give you a bit of a wow moment as you come in and spin around the corner and you're presented with all of these boats in a really beautiful way. Like it is pretty impressive.
One of the little things that made me smile, and you'll correct me if this is no longer the case, but I think you have the boat that Redgrave and Pinsent won their Sydney Olympic medal in. Is that right? 4?
We do,
and
yeah.
Taped to the side of it is a rigger jigger that Matthew Pinsent took in the boat for the final in case he needed to tighten up any of the nuts. Is that right?
Well, it was there, and then someone pinched it, believe it or not. So it's one of the perils of working with the general public. But yeah, the boat itself was down on at ground level in one of our displays, and as well as the rigger jigger, there was also a sachet of brown sugar which Steve Redgrave had taped to his seat because obviously, dealing with diabetes, he may have needed that getting up to the start line. And both of those, I'm afraid to say, were pinched. So the Sydney 4 is now strung up on the ceiling out of harm's way.
I'd like to donate to the River and Rhone Museum a replacement for both of those two precious items. You just need to pass them through the hands of the illustrious rowers who put them there so that you can sort of authenticate them.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. That'd be great.
Now, 35,000 objects, they're obviously not all on display at once. So have you got a massive storage facility in the basement or something?
We do have a separate storage facility within Henley. And we have on display, we have about 2,000 of those items. We then have about another 2,000 of what we call 3D objects. So, boats, bits and pieces from the river, various items we've been donated. And then around about 30,000 what we call archive bits of material. So films, photos, press cuttings, books, all that sort of stuff that tells those stories over time. So it's incredible actually to try and manage that size of collection because being an accredited museum means it's a bit like being an affiliated club with British Rowing. There are certain standards we have to meet as a museum. So we have to know for every one of those 35,000 objects where it is, who owns it, what permissions we've got for it, what conditions it's in, how long we can keep it for. Every time someone touches it, we have to document it. So we have a team of curators that manage that process. So it's highly involved, but also great. I mean, one of my sort of guilty pleasures is going back into the archives and having a look at what we've got, because as a bit of a rowing geek, you really can get your fill of incredible bits and pieces we have around the place.
Now, history may not be everybody's cup of tea, but if you think about rowing and the number of years that you and I have been in the sport, we've seen a ton of changes, whether it's gone, the oar designs, like every couple of years, there are improvements and changes that come out, all the apps that are now available. Maybe you should have a copy in the museum. I've just suggested the Rebecca Carroll Rowing App Gallery. But we can actually see, if we choose to use our eyes, real change happening in the sport. So what does rowing mean to you in the context of history?
That's a really good question. I think that we're really lucky with rowing that it's been going for so long as we know it. So arguably about 300 years we've had competitive rowing on the Thames, starting with the Watermen and then going all the way through now, as you say, to the Olympics. So I think why it's important to show that is we are allowed to track the evolution of the sport. And so from a performance point of view, you can track over time how performance and training patterns change and how you see the relevant improvements, and how actually the real purpose of a museum is to look backwards so you can make predictions on what's coming. The boat race is a great example of that. We all know about the training regime that those incredible athletes go through now alongside full-time studies. But about 100 years ago, one of the training sessions was a half-mile walk in a heavy coat, and we've got that documented. And so you can track over time, if you look at the history of the sport, how those improvements are made, and then you can start making predictions on where performance gains may come from in the future. But I think also there's something around the history of rowing that actually a lot of things don't change, and at the end of the day, it's a unified crew trying to perfect that stroke together in order to win a race. And I think in an ever-changing world, and in a world that's changing more rapidly every day, there's something quite reassuring about that. So just this morning, I was reading about the 1908 Olympics, which was out here at Henley. And I was reading the race report of the final of Leander against the Belgians. And they were talking about how the Belgian crew hit a bit of wash, lost their rhythm, and Leander moved by half a length and were able to hold that to the line. And that's, that could be the regatta last year. And so I think there's, as I say, in an ever-changing world, there's something quite reassuring to see that we as rowers are part of something that has been consistent for centuries and hopefully will continue so.
I personally think that is a fantastic reason for having a river and rowing museum in Henley-on-Thames. And the ability to tell stories around our sport and our appreciation of those stories is a heavy burden. So, Stephen, what would you like people to do now they've perhaps found out about the museum for the first time? They just come and see you. What would you like listeners to do?
Well, if they're in the UK or visiting the UK, certainly come and visit, because we'd love to get the museum more widely known. It's actually fascinating the number of people that don't know about the museum. So we'd love people to come and visit first and foremost. And then really, we'd love to hear about the stories that people think we should be telling, because it's a museum for our visitors. And so we want that feedback and insight, because then we can react to it and we can make changes and tell stories that people want. So really, it's come and visit and talk to us and let us know what you think and where you think we should be going.
And the Rowing Museum website is
rrm.co.uk.
Well, I'm going to make the very first suggestion. I hope you've got a pen ready. I think you should be doing something about the growth of participation in masters athletes. Because
absolutely. Well, as one myself now, I can absolutely agree.
We'll talk about it afterwards.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I hope all the listeners and viewers get online and take a look at the museum website. And they learn a little bit about what you've got on public display. But more importantly, go and have a look at it. It's not a dull museum. It is a massive participation museum. And if you have any appreciation of rowing as a sport and something that you enjoy yourself, you should know that you have contributed to the rowing history of what's happening right now in the sport. So until next time, I've been Rebecca Caro, and this is Faster Masters Rowing Radio.
We are part of the Rowing Chat Podcast Network. Please tell your rowing friends about the show. And if you've learned just one helpful thing from today's episode, please consider supporting the show for as little as $1 per month by visiting fastermastersrowing.com/podcast.